Salim, you vied for the Conservative Party to run for the Conservative Party of Canada, and you were rejected by them for reasons that we've enumerated several times on the air and on YouTube. And that to you, I thought, was an epiphany, that was the end of your idea that the Conservative Party of Canada, just like the rhinos in the States, the Republicans in name only, are not friends of freedom. They're not friends of free speech. They're not friends of free thinking. They are a firewall between the individual Canadian who wants to be free, individually free, and an overpowering collectivist state, especially now with Justin Trudeau in power, locking up Canadians, making them pay for it in hotels owned by China. We just cannot seem to break through. We as individual Canadians trying to live free, as long as a Conservative Party, the official opposition here in this country, is a party of elitism, a party of the left, and I can get into the details about that. We've done it many times before. And I'd like to pick your brain, you as a university professor who've spent your life studying this, right? Conservatism, you as a conservative, small c conservative person, a classical liberal, using your own definition of yourself, and I would agree with that as well as myself. How did we come to this point where all of the individualists in this nation, and there's a lot of us, rely on a party like the Conservative Party and an Aaron O'Toole to save us when we know historically they never have acted as conservatives, small c conservatives. They've always acted as a party on the left, as a socialist party, as a party of elites, as a liberal light. How did that happen, that they usurped this name conservative? You are steeped in the history of the evolution of conservatism and liberalism and classical liberalism, both in Canada and around the world, especially Britain and the United States. Let's start off then by just defining our terms. What is conservatism?
Thank you, Robert. Yes, trying to define or giving a definition of conservatism and who is a conservative is, I'm reminded, taking and wearing the hat that you've just put on me, that of an academic who spent a life reading and thinking and in some small way writing about this and speaking about this, of the American classic by Russell Kirk, first published in 1953, The Conservative Mind. The book was called The Conservative Mind. Russell Kirk set out exactly in an effort to do what you are asking for, that is a definition. And he ended up, if I remember right from the outset in his opening remarks in the book, ended up writing almost 500 pages long essay trying to define conservatism and what is conservative. And he ended up talking about that there is basically no way to define conservatism, because the conservatism is not a set of dogma or doctrine. It is a state of mind. It is an attitude towards life and therefore towards politics. It is attachment to certain principles in life to which you then want to defend in the public sphere and in the public space. And it is in some ways, and this is not Russell Kirk's words, it is my words, it is in some ways a love affair of the individual who is a conservative that you might call, say, an Edmund Burke or Ronald Reagan, and in our time that we have just been witnessing history, that is Donald Trump. It is a love affair of that individual with his land, his country, that country's history, that country's institutions, in terms of the constitution, the rules, the traditions. And it is that love affair that then becomes translated into political action, in the sense of trying to maintain those things and ideas and institutions and values which one cherishes as something sacred. And that is what a conservative is. Let me add here something else. I think one of the reasons that if you ask, say, a Stephen Harper and today, and I don't know, Toole, or people who opposed Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump was the leader of the Republican Party, by the virtue of being the president, having been elected the president, his own party leaders like Mitch McConnell or Mitt Romney and others who opposed Donald Trump, if you ask them, what is it about you calling yourself Republicans or conservative that you opposed Donald Trump, and those people who had opposed Ronald Reagan, for instance, or those in England who opposed Maggie Thatcher? What is it about it? Why do you stand in opposition to these people or to the values that they are standing for in public life? Well, one of the things that they will run away from is that if they don't oppose these people or what they stand for, then their adversary in politics and in public life, that is the Democrats, and the entire body of people who support the Democratic Party in America, that is the media, the academia, the business elite, and the same thing in Canada it would be. They will label you as a reactionary because, what the Democratic Party stand for, say, is the Rainbow Coalition. In Canada, multiculturalism, support for minorities, support for, today it is identity politics and genderism. And so a conservative, in standing and opposing these things or talking in terms of the older values that made America, that made Canada, that made Britain what we associate with Canada, America, and Britain, they would be called reactionary. And so I would say I am a proud reactionary because that's what a conservative is. Conservative is a person, as I said, a state of mind, an attitude, a way of looking at the world, is in public life as or in reaction to the agenda of the people on the left who are pushing for whatever they want to push for it. Identity politics, transgenderism, unlimited spending, expansion of the government, control over individual life, shrinking of that means freedom. These are issues that they're pushing for, in effect, for having greater power in society and through expansion of government. And a conservative should, by all logic and definition, should stand opposed to them. I mean, remember Bill Buckley, the great conservative thinker and writer, the founder of National Review in America in the 1950s, whose first book was God and Man at Yale. He was famous for that crying out loud, I stand athwart history to stop it. To stop what? That is to stop this mad rush towards expansion of the power of the state over the individual, and therefore diminishing the space within which the individual is free to act and choose and do the things that the individual wants to do without being coerced to doing otherwise. So I think there it is. There's a fear of being called a reactionary, and therefore not willing to stand up in opposition to the agenda of the left. And then by not doing that over a period of time, and that period of time becoming then a historical era, what you have just talked about, the Conservative Party in Canada, for instance, have gone along with the left. And over time, it becomes indistinguishable from the left. The left in Canada being the Liberal Party and the NDP and so on. And that raises the question in terms of definition that the conservative can be only defined in that sense, a state of mind, an attitude, a way of looking at the world, and cherishing those values that needs to be defended in terms of a reaction to the left. So what is the left? What is the liberals? And that's where I think the challenge of definition lies.
You know, in our conversations leading up to this video, we were had an email exchange and a telephone exchange about this, and I really loved your email from yesterday where you, to encapsulate what you just said, you wrote, conservatism is not an ideology, but an attitude towards life and politics, a state of mind or thinking, a manner of living, a commitment to an ideal that is rooted in history, a respect for tradition and faith and community on the basis of accepting that there is sacredness in life and living which transcends an individual in his time and place, and therefore continuity of institutions through which public life is mediated is important. And from this it follows that while change is a given, as part of our nature and as natural, conservatives do not make change a fetish to be sought or desired for the sake of change. Brilliant, Salim, because that, to me, sort of defines in opposition what large L liberalism here in Canada means. Instead of having a love of the sacredness of life and the continuity of traditions, liberalism, capital L liberalism, in this country is nothing but destruction. It's nothing but tearing down and destroying traditions and the rights of the individual. You may as well just have torn up the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the last year, as the Liberals have done, and everything that led up to this point, it's been destroyed. Liberalism is a death cult. I've always said that. The left is a death cult. While conservatism, not to be... what was going through my mind when you were giving that definition is that, it sounds as if the conservatives are always on the defensive, always reacting to somebody else's push, the liberals' push. That sounds to me, inaccurately in my own mind, of course, that conservatives will and always will be on the defensive and always in opposition to a group, the liberals, who are out there every single minute of every single day trying to think of ways to just mess things up. And if we are always on the defensive, these small c conservatives, always on the defensive, won't we always be out of the halls of power?
Yes, I mean, if we assume that the people who, I mean, we're talking about democracy, so that's a given, right? So we're not talking about in a society that is a one-party state like former Soviet Union or China or Iran or Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera. We're talking about a democracy and a rule of law and a system which is what we are in Canada, what United States has been for at least the last, in the case of United States, almost 250 years. In the case of Canada, we are one of the oldest democracies, over 150 years. So in that context, if the people who vote and who elect a political party to form a government are going to be always in a state of agitation with their living condition, whatever that living condition is and situation is, and they're always perpetually in agitation and want things to be changed just for the sake of getting out of that agitated state of mind. In that context, the parties on the left, say in Canada, the Liberal Party, in America, the Democratic Party, will attract more attention from the people who vote. That is, they will be constantly offering them new ways of getting away from whatever it is agitating them. You know, they will take care of them in terms of their schooling. They will take care of them in terms of their healthcare. They will take care of them in terms of their housing. In effect, starting from wherever you are to whatever they will offer, is they will take care of the people by depriving the people of their own choice to make their own living, right? And in that sense, yes, the conservatives are handicapped. And so an agitated state of mind of people will be perpetually seeking a way out of their own situation and grasping for what is offered to them by the left. Unless the conservative can contend with that sort of situation and keep also making similar offer to the people, they will be deprived of forming a government. So that's a given. Yeah. Occasionally, very infrequently, when there is a total corruption and collapse of what the left is offering, then the people might say, okay, we will go along with the Conservative Party or what is seen as the opposition to the Liberal Party. And that has basically been the state of Canadian politics. I mean, you take the last 100 years, you know, you go back to the late 1920, early 1930s, that is R.G. Bennett's government in 1930. Between 1930 and now we are in 2021, that's 91 years, almost a century. There has been only 3 majority governments on the part of the Conservative Party in Canada or the Progressive Conservative Party. And the rest of the time it has been liberal governments. You know, the governments are in that spectrum of left-right is being left-wing governments of the Liberal Party. In the United States, it's completely different in that sense. I mean, in the United States, in the post-war situation, now post-1945, that you see the rise of the Democratic Party in terms of forming government or being a majority party. But from the Civil War till it was the Republican Party that was the dominant party. And that raises a whole lot of other interesting questions. How come the Republican Party in United States after the Civil War was a dominant political party, lost that, you know? And this is where we come into the real situation, not from the ideal situation of giving definition, the real situation. Both United States and Canada, including Great Britain, has over the last almost 100 years seen, as a result of the 2 world wars, depression, and the Cold War, a massive expansion of state power. An expansion of state power means the greater control by the government in the lives of the people or of the lives of the people. You know, the more you put demand through taxation, the less the people have who produce wealth to keep for themselves, because a larger and larger portion of that revenue is taken away by the government, you know, simply to the matter. I mean, so income tax came into effect in North America during World War One. You know, so we're talking about this 100-year period. This massive expansion of government power, plus the opening up of the country to immigration from outside of cultures that were not cultures which were part of this or similar to the culture of both America and Canada. I'm referring to the people of European background as opposed to people of non-European background. So there has been a massive expansion in terms of immigration and migration of people from cultures other than European cultures, which were the founding cultures of North America. It has been a huge factor in the rise of the politics of the left. Then there have been massive changes as a result of technology in the social life of the people. I mean, during the 20th century, and particularly in the second half of the 20th century, our social life was profoundly changed as a result of technology. And the one particular thing that I have in mind is the medicine that brought about way to control fertility, and therefore, you know, women were able to get into the workforce. The pill, and that changed almost just about everything in terms of family and individuals and women in the workforce and so on. So all of that has had a massive impact in the disruption of what was at one time seen as a traditional society, you know, within which the Conservative Party or people with conservative bent of mind were seen as the natural leaders. And therefore, the Republican Party was the dominant party between the Civil War and World War II. And in Canada, for that little period of time, Canadian history is different because we are tied to Great Britain. First, as we were part of Great Britain, we were a satellite of Great Britain, as a dominion of Great Britain. And then subsequently, you know, as we became free and independent, our history shifted from being under the cover of Great Britain to going under the cover of first the United States, and then looking for a third option, going under the cover or going along with the European, the EEC, during the period of Pierre Elliott Trudeau and after. So our history is somewhat different than the United States. And in our history, in the Canadian history, we don't have a landed aristocracy. So the Conservatives, that was Johnny MacDonald conservative, they basically disappeared during World War I. As I said, the Conservatives are a state of mind, an attitude, a feeling, and standing up for the love of one's land, country. The attachment of Conservatives in Canada was the attachment in that larger sense, loyalty and tradition that came from Britain, you know, and so it was the attachment and loyalty to the empire. But as the empire faded away, the Conservative did not adjust or didn't find its anchor. It was the Liberals that morphed into more and more on the left. Last Liberal that was truly a Liberal was Wilfrid Laurier. The Liberals that came to power during and after World War I, with the immense expansion of the government, were people like Mackenzie King, who became the longest serving prime minister in Canadian history during the interwar years and through the Second World War. And this expansion of government powers, that is the expansion and control of the state, which I would call corporatism, government making the investment through taxation, through control of the economy, meant that, the conservatives or the progressive conservative became a Me Too party, that we can do the same thing, but we will do it maybe with some different styles, some different version,
more
some different
efficiently.
rhetoric. Yeah, but on the main issues that came to define Canadian politics, it was all driven by the central government, by the federal government, by the state, both in terms of social investment, social entitlements, Medicare, then multiculturalism, bilingualism. All of these were state-controlled policies.
By the way, Salim, both of those measures, the official multiculturalism and official bilingualism, came in under conservative or progressive conservative governments. I know that the official multiculturalism was purely a Trudeau idea, but it was implemented under Mulroney, a conservative.
That's exactly, in a sense, whether it is multiculturalism came around in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and Trudeau, pushed that. But you go back to the bigger issues, the Depression years. R.G. Bennett was there, but his was a stopgap government. It was Mackenzie King, then R.G. Bennett came, then he lost, and King came back. So the expansion of government that took place during the interwar years, that is between the two world wars, were largely driven by the Liberal Party, and dealing with the issue of depression, and therefore investments, creating the social welfare benefits and entitlements. The same thing was happening in United States with Roosevelt, who came to power in 1932 in the midst of the Depression. And then the Depression morphed into the World War. Wars have led to expansion of government controls. And expansion of government control, the flip side of it is the diminution of individual freedom. It's almost like a zero-sum game. So I might point out here something very fascinating. We don't have the time to go into depths of history, but in 20th century politics in both United States and in Canada, you can see that the Democratic Party in the United States, and the Liberals have just followed them, the Democratic Party in the United States is a war party. In the first half of the 20th century, from 1900 to the 1950s, there were 5 Republican presidents and there were 3 Democratic presidents. But it was the 3 Democratic presidents that engaged America in wars.
And now Joe Biden, within a couple of weeks of taking office, what does he do? Bomb Syria without, by the way, the sanction of Congress. Just an executive order bombs, well, not executive order, but a decision to bomb Syria. They are warmongers.
Yeah. So you step back and you think about this, that would lead us into the whole issue, Robert. You're absolutely right about Joe Biden right now and the events that have happened. It will lead us back to, again, examining the issue of the deep state that now we have become, part of our language, and what has happened. Deep state means, again, the arms of the government, particularly those aspect of the government that is dealing with security issues, national security, both in terms of foreign policy, intelligence, and the surveillance state that is domestically, the rise of the police state, for instance, and all the various agencies, The same thing is repeated in the second half, but the first half, the history is over. We can look at it. Five Republican president, you can run through the name: Theodore Roosevelt, Robert Taft, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, and somebody else that name escapes me right now. Will come back. They were the Republican president. There was no war. The war was started or entered into by Woodrow Wilson, 1917, taking America into World War I. Same thing with Woodrow Wilson, then Franklin Roosevelt, 1939, 1941, and there's a whole discussion about whether Roosevelt was engaged in duplicity in a manner in which it led to eventually the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor. But that's a whole different complex issue. But it was Roosevelt who was the war president. And then after Roosevelt, the man who succeeded him, Truman, it was under his watch that the Korean War started, and then the Cold War started. Korean War led to the Cold War in that sense of the term. So, and in the second half of the 20th century, you see, the Republican presidents like Eisenhower refused to take America into any conflict anywhere in the world. He was very, very careful about Vietnam. It was Kennedy and Johnson who took America into war in Vietnam on a very questionable circumstances. In fact, they talk about it was a lie that Johnson went into the war with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in 1964. And the Republican president, I just mentioned Eisenhower, it was Nixon who tried to end that war, peace with honor, but then the Democrats took him out over Watergate. And Ronald Reagan was the guy who ended the Cold War, in a sense, didn't start any new war, ended the Cold War.
Peace through superior
but
firepower.
after Ronald Reagan, you have Uniparty. It is no longer, as you mentioned, the rhinos, the Republican in name only, the Bushes. And so the Bushes, the Clintons, the Obamas, they were all involved in endless wars, which is what Donald Trump tried to end. So wars have been the instrument both in European politics, in North American politics, that is democratic society. The warmongers expand the control of the government. They bring about big governments. They empower the state over the people. In Canada, we are a small country. We don't create wars, or we don't trigger wars, but we have participated in wars. We have participated in wars as ally of the empire or satellite of the empire when the British were dominant, and then as allies of the United States, during the Cold War years and so on. But coming back to the issue, so long the left have the edge on saying that the government will take care of you, whoever the you is, in that sense, the electorate. The electorate somehow will buy into that argument that the government is taking care of you. Look at the irony and the paradox right now. In the name of health, the government will take care of you from COVID-19. We have completely shut down the economy, in fact, destroyed the economy, and in that means, basically, we have wrecked our freedom, our individual rights.
By the way, that not just the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau is doing this, but every Conservative premier in the country are also doing those kinds of measures to destroy our charter rights and our individual rights. So it crosses party lines once again. There is no difference in that respect between Conservatives and Liberals.
Absolutely. But from a historical and philosophical, in terms of political philosophy point of view, we need to step back and put some sort of a larger context. I don't know how much time we have, but I would say to you that all of this begins in Europe, in the sense, the mother of all parliaments is, of course, the British Parliament. So, Britain is the model, particularly for all of us English-speaking countries, so United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I would also include India in that sense. The official language of India is English, by the way, and the system of government democracy, a constitutional government, a democracy with a parliament model after the British Parliament. So we have to go back to Britain, in terms of talking about conservatives, liberals, labor, socialists, and so on and so forth. So here, very quickly, in a nutshell, the conservatives in Britain are not the conservatives in its origin as what we have in North America. The terms are the same term, but the content is completely different. To be a conservative in Britain, that is to be a Tory, was to belong to the landed aristocracy. The classic division as the British parliamentary system started emerging and consolidating itself, say, in the 17th century, with the legacy of the previous several centuries to build upon, the division was between the Tories and the Whig. The Whigs were the liberals. They were liberals, and the Tories were the conservatives. But the Tories belonged to the landed aristocracy, the lords and dukes and so on, connected with the monarchy. And the Whigs, that is the liberals, were the new emerging class, mercantile class, as Britain became a more and more of a trading nation, and that's the Welsh generation. So they were a trading nation. And the classical argument that started all of this, you go back to Adam Smith writing The Wealth of Nation, published the year of the American Revolution, 1776. And other writers of that early 18th century. It is about having open market, free market, the French term laissez-faire, free enterprise and support for free enterprise. And the Tories, the conservatives in that sense, opposing it, because it was their landed interest. They wanted to control the market,
It's interesting that you bring up laissez-faire, Salim, and the Tories in Britain opposing it, because R.B. Bennett, in Canadian history, the conservative prime minister in the 30s, was famous for this quote, and I paraphrase here, "I am for reform." And to me, reform means government intervention and the end of laissez-faire. That from a conservative in Canada.
Right. So you see, the words don't have the same meaning. I mean, R.B. Bennett is in the late 1920s and early 1930s, right? History has completely changed by then, and in terms of the dynamics that have taken place, the developments that took place. And what I was driving at, you're absolutely right to bring that point. Therefore, reform, and reform is the expansion of the government over the lives of the people. But that was not the liberal agenda in the terms of Whig party in the 18th and 19th century. The greatest, or one of the most famous, not the greatest, one of the most famous Whig from the 18th century is Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke is seen as the father of conservatism in North America, which is an irony because Burke was a liberal. He was. So how does one explain that? One explains that, again, in a nutshell, one goes back to the fundamental understanding that politics as it evolved in the 17th and 18th century in a society such as Britain, which is, as I said, the mother of all parliament, the beginning of democracy in that sense, even though it was a corrupt democracy, reformation would take place, reforms would happen in the 19th century and 20th century. But the fact that there was a parliament, there was a people electing representatives, parties were founded, and positions were taken. Two things we must keep in mind. One is that all of this is happening in the context of the age of enlightenment and the ideas of the age of enlightenment. And today, looking back at it and trying to put it in a nutshell, in a sort of, as you ask, can we define enlightenment, if we say? Well, yes, we would say the age of enlightenment is the birth of the idea of individual freedom, the dare to know, the dare to challenge, whether it is Galileo looking at the world through a telescope and challenging the authorized version of cosmology based upon the view of the Catholic Church, that is, the world is stationary and the sun goes around the earth, and so on and so forth, and challenging that view, which is what Galileo did or Copernicus was doing. And then, of course, the greatest of them all was Newton, and so on. And then the political philosophers that were following the physicists and the scientists by trying to make a science out of history and politics. It is the rise of the notion of freedom, and governments are a contract between free people. And that leads to, representative government, the writings of John Locke and others. And so it is in that context, the idea of freedom, opposing censorship, opposing controls by the monarch, that is by the state, was the birth of liberalism. To be a liberal was to, as the very word in French says, liberty, freedom. So yes, we can define it. The age of enlightenment brings around the culture of freedom, and there is no freedom unless it is individual freedom. So it is the birth of that. The left that emerges in the 19th century, of course, Marx is in that sense the iconic name, the great name. The left, in French politics, the left came about in the French Revolution, the Jacobins. The left are the bastard children of the age of enlightenment. They are the opposition to the ideas of the age of enlightenment. They see from their argument, it is the notion of freedom is a false notion. This is a bourgeois idea, freedom. You're not free unless you're well fed and you have equal property and equal this and equal that, And so you try to take away or destroy that false notion of freedom by state power that will emancipate the worker, The original liberalism, which we might call today classical liberalism, is about freedom.
As a matter of fact, Salim, people should remember that Sir John A. Macdonald, thought of as a conservative, of course, because of his love of the empire, was the leader of the Liberal Conservative Party. It wasn't called the Conservative Party, it was the Liberal Conservative Party for decades.
Correct. And the reason that you might say it was an oxymoron, liberal conservative, and Johnny Macdonald in that one phase of his politics was taking and identifying himself as a liberal conservative, was in some ways, from my reading of his biography, both by Donald Creighton and by Richard Gwynne, Johnny Macdonald was a child of the Victorian age. And in that sense, if he had been in Britain, he possibly would be a high Tory or possibly a Burkean liberal, if he had been in Britain. I mean, he was born in Scotland, he was born in Glasgow. If his parents had not migrated, he would have grown up in Britain. He might have gone to Parliament, and his natural party. He did not come from a landed aristocracy. He possibly would have been a member of the Whig Party. That means he would have been a liberal, or he might have ended up like Disraeli, being a Tory. That is, his love for the glamour, the values, the country, and he end up as a monarchist, and he could have ended up as a monarchist. I don't know, but that is the contradiction. But here he is in Canada, and he cannot resolve that contradiction. He wants to be loyal to Britain, that is the empire, and at the same time, he wants freedom. He wants to establish, Canada, which is what he was the founding father of Canada. He wants to establish a country that will cherish freedom. When you look south to the United States, the Civil War has ended. The Republican Party is in power, and the Republican Party is a party in that sense of a party of freedom, because they're a party that has fought against slavery and emancipated slavery, So if you put all of this in context, it is a very fascinating thing. But putting it in a definitional term, you have to put it in the context of the Age of Enlightenment. And so the original ideas of freedom is with the Whig Party. And I was going back to Burke. And look, Burke, who was a member of the Whig Party, that is a liberal party, and as a liberal, he supported the American Revolution of 1776. And then, 12 years later, he is the strongest opponent of the French Revolution. In fact, he is revered by the people who are conservatives or classical liberal for his book, the book that made him most famous, Reflections on the French Revolution, and that's the book that is read, by people in North America to understand conservatism, which is a misnomer. It is to understand liberalism, and to understand liberalism in that sense, that is classical liberalism, and why Burke supported the American Revolution, is to understand that the American Revolution was, in modern terms, a conservative revolution. In the period of 1776, it was a classical liberal revolution. In other words, the American Revolution was a revolution against George III because of George III's despotism or tyranny or misrule. And that's why Edmund Burke, sitting in the British Parliament, was opposed to his monarch, George III, and supporting George Washington in America, because the tradition of the British liberals go back all the way to Magna Carta. That Magna Carta is about constraining the monarch, that is the state, on behalf of, at that time, it was the barons, but the idea is to develop a system which will constrain the monarch, the state, on behalf of the people. And that is what led to the Civil War in the 17th century, which ultimately led to the beheading of Charles I in 1648. The killing of the monarch in Britain was to establish the supremacy of the parliament. That was a liberal agenda. That is freedom.
Now that we've brought up the beheading of a monarch, let's turn to Justin Trudeau. And I want to ask you the question, because I think we should probably talk for at least another 15 minutes on this, Salim, to put some sort of constraint on it. You said at the beginning in your definition of conservatism that it is not an ideology. And I take that notion and then I look at all of the internal struggles and problems that the conservative parties in Canada over the last 100 120 years or 150 years have gone through, from John A. Macdonald calling his party the Liberal Conservative Party, to in the 40s, I think it was the 40s, changing it, or no, 60s, changing it to Progressive Conservative Party, the breakaway of conservatives to form the Bloc Québécois, the breakaway of people in Ontario's Progressive Conservative Party, like Randy Hillier, whenever they talk about something that was against the doctrine of the leader of the Progressive Conservatives in Ontario, like there's no free speech in Ontario conservatism today. These infighting, public displays of infighting and conflict constantly through 150 years of Conservative Party history probably reflects the fact that they are a party in search of a political ideology, whereas the Liberals have always been the Liberals. They've always had this liberal policy of, as we mentioned before, change for the sake of change, destruction for the sake of destruction. If something works, it has to be wrong in some respect, destroy it. That's the liberal philosophy, the capital L liberal philosophy, not the classical liberalism. And so here we are in Canada today. Let's bring it to the present day. We have Erin O'Toole in charge of the Conservative Party of Canada, and given the history of duplicity that Conservatives have always shown towards their supporters, vote for us, we'll do this, they never do it. Vote for us and we will get rid of this, they never get rid of it. There's only one thing that of substance that a Conservative Party ever repealed, and that was the National Energy Program with Brian Mulroney, getting rid of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau National Energy program. It only took him 2 years in power to get rid of it. Other than that, it's been a party of deceit, a party of lies, just to get power. They look at people like you and I and our friends, small c conservatives, classical liberals, individuals looking for individual freedom, and they lie to us to say that, oh, we're conservative too. And then they get in power and they keep everything that Liberals or NDP or other parties have done. They even implement their own left-wing socialist policies, and we're supposed to vote for them again? Here's my question to you. Are Conservatives stupid? Because we keep voting these people in. I mean, I don't vote for them, but we keep voting for the Conservative Party because of the name.
Well, I mean, I think all of this thing is in some ways very peculiar in Canada, because the Canadian situation is very peculiar as a result of, first of all, the division between English and French. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have to take that into account whenever we're talking about Canadian politics. The Liberal Party in Canada is only in name liberal. I mean, if you talk about lies, conservatives are liars. The biggest fraud is that the Liberal Party is not about liberty. It is about government. It is about state. It is about the expansion of government. And it is through the government and the expansion of government that the Canadian state, in terms of the French-English divide in its original situation, has been kept together, the compact. And the French side of the equation, that is Quebec, has been basically corporatist right from the beginning. During the period before the Dominion, 1867, that was their defensive mechanism to maintain their identity as French in a North American continent, which was predominantly English and also predominantly non-Catholic. So that is a factor, and to be given that factor once the Dominion was created or established 1867 and after, the Quebec side of the equation ironically became the dominant side, influencing the English side rather than the English side influencing the Quebec side, and so this 150-year history has to be taken into account. I mean, we are the only country in the world, Robert, if you think about it through and its implication, we're the only country where 80% of the population do not speak French, which is the official language. We are a bilingual country, so there are two official languages, English and French. But 80% of the people are non-functional in French, and then you have 20% of the people who are French, but who are more or less to maintain their situation and their lifestyle and their position in public affairs, they are bilingual. And so what do we have? We have a situation where to be effective in government, especially in the central government, the federal government, and all the institutions of the federal government, you have to be bilingual, and that excludes 80% of the population from participating. So that culture of bilingualism, which excludes almost 80% of the population from having any say, effective say, in the matters of the running of the federal institution, leaves it to the 20%. And that 20%, or people who become assimilated into that 20% with great deal of difficulty, sometimes like Stephen Harper becoming, learning French and being somewhat functional in French during the time that he was a prime minister, conservative prime minister. What we have is that the 80% is it is the tail wagging the dog syndrome in Canadian politics, and the tail is heavily corporatist. It is heavily state oriented. So I think that's a huge factor. It's also a taboo subject. It's a taboo subject in which we cannot openly discuss this matter. If we openly discuss, there is going to be penalty, especially if you're interested in public life. You're going to be penalized. This is not discussed in the media. This is not discussed in the academia. So the 80% is handcuffed in that sense. Then you have the situation in which the vastness of the country, the geography of the country, we are the second largest real estate in the world, Canada as a country, 5 time zone. But in terms of population, we are a very small country, 37 million people, which is less than the population of California in America, strung along the US-Canada border, basically, with along the 49th parallel, with a vast amount of territory that is inhabitable unless we make massive investment in terms of trying to contend with our frigid north. So that means, again, massive expansion of the government powers, and that is what has happened. And you have a situation where the Liberal Party has a control because it is effectively based out of Quebec. And now Ontario is where the Liberal Party has a control over the last half century because of the open-ended migration and immigration that has basically brought about a situation where, in your opening remarks, a people that is become dependent upon entitlements will look to the state, to the government, and that's where the Liberal Party is. The Liberal Party can talk from both ends of its mouth because it practices the art of lying, so to say, because in effect, the Liberal Party has the Socialist Party, which is the NDP, as its junior partner, can push forward the most left-wing ideas and ideology and policies, which then can be shaved and smoothed out by the liberals and adopted as a liberal policy. And that's what exactly has been happening over the last 50 years. So the partnership or the bridge building that exists between the Liberal Party and the NDP effectively makes Canada a left-wing country in that sense. That is a heavily corporatist country. By the way, corporatism as an idea and as a public policy emerged in European politics in the 1920s after World War I. You know, it was Mussolini who was a practitioner, the first practitioner of corporatism, and then it was adopted later on in Germany by Hitler, and now basically all of European states are corporatists in one nature or another. It's not an open free market country anywhere, not even in Britain. So Canada is heavily a corporatist state in that sense. And the Conservative Party is only in name conservative. As you say, it's a big lie. There's nothing conservative about Conservative Party. It is simply a party that wants to be in government. One half of the elite that identifies with the Conservative Party simply wants to play the role of as a team to have this rotation in Ottawa between the Liberal and the Conservative that has happened, and that they can be in the government for the period of time that the Liberal become too arrogant, too corrupt, too intolerable, even by the public, as happens periodically. And so the Conservatives are there just to step in as the B team, and then hand it back to the Liberal when the Liberals have changed the optics about themselves. And in that context, people like yourself and myself and others who have been members of the Conservative Party or joined Conservative Party,
I hadn't been a member of the
public
Conservative
life,
Party.
we had no place to go to. So we ended up hopefully joining and hoping that we could make some changes within the party. Till now we know that that is not possible. You know, it's a learning process. There has to be a party that stands up, which is not has nothing to do with the name, as I said. It has to do with the state of mind and values, and there are certain principles that you hold on to, and those principles are the principle of family, faith, tradition, that you hold something sacred. And what we hold sacred is those ideas that emerge out of the Age of Enlightenment, you know, that actually built what the West is. But it has been taken over by the illegitimate or bastard child of the Age of Enlightenment.
Okay, so that brings up the notion of the People's Party of Canada, now led by Maxime Bernier, who, thankfully, and I didn't know that I would say this, thankfully is a Quebecer, a French-speaking Quebecer, because if a People's Party of Canada started from, say, an Albertan or somebody from Saskatchewan or the Maritimes, whatever, that would have been thought of as totally alienating Quebec and the French. But because Maxime is a Quebecer, a French-speaking Quebecer, he has embraced, he calls himself a small c conservative, quite rightly, he has embraced exactly what you're talking about. The ideas of the Enlightenment, freedom of speech, you know, freedom of association, freedom of movement. He is totally opposed to all of the measures that we see today for health and safety reasons. The only party in Canada, by the way, to do that, other than perhaps the Freedom Party of Ontario. But what do you think, now that we have seen through 2020, in hindsight, so to speak, a shifting from an Erin O'Toole and a Doug Ford, PC leader in Ontario, right? People, conservatives, are saying enough is enough. Is the past year enough to make us small c conservatives migrate towards Maxime's People's Party? Or will people like us, the individualists, the enlightened child of the Enlightenment people, will we always be the rump of Canadian federal politics?
You're asking me to look into the crystal ball instead of giving a sort of a, which is where I stand, putting things in historical context. You know, I don't think even if I look into the crystal ball, I would say that I don't think that we should remain a rump if enough Canadians do awaken to what you are pointing out. That is, this past year of lockdown and curtailment of our freedoms in every way, and the destruction of our economy in so many ways that has happened. On the one side is the complete abandonment of any fiscal responsibility. I mean, our deficit has ballooned to almost $400 billion. Only 2 years ago, in 2019 election, we were around about, in the $30 billion range of our deficit that we were talking about. We're not talking about the debt. Our debt is now close to $2 trillion. That is almost twice the GDP. So we have wrecked our economy, small business. We have deprived our children. I mean, a child who's 5 years old, 20% of his life has been taken away from him. And can we come back? And in what way can we come back? If enough people seriously think about this, then there should be a revulsion against every single political party and leader that has been holding the reins of power from British Columbia to Prince Edward Island.
What about Newfoundland? Don't forget Newfoundland.
Pardon?
Don't forget Newfoundland. Canada doesn't end at PEI.
Well, I mean, it doesn't end also, where it is. I mean, Nunavut and up north, from Arctic Circle to the 49th parallel. But that's what I mean, our 10 provinces and 2 territories or 3 territories and so on. Every single one of them need to be, with revulsion thrown out. But whether the people will do that or not is a whole different issue. I mean, by the way, the government that a democracy has is the government that the people deserve, because the people vote for that government.
Yes, but we don't deserve it. You and I don't deserve it, I can tell you that.
So, we don't know. But the interesting point, I mean, your observation about PPC and Maxime is fascinating, and I will quickly point out a few things. I mean, we can go into great detail, but again, the economy of time. One, Maxime, who we know personally, you know him, I know him, I've known him for many years before he left the Conservative Party and became the leader, founded the PPC, and invited me to join him, and I did. Maxime belongs to that tradition. He's a man from Quebec, but he's also French in that sense, French culture, French history. He belongs to that tradition in French culture and French history that is the French part of the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment was a European phenomenon. So there's the English side of it, there's the French side, the Scottish side, the German side, and so on and so forth. So there's the French side is very rich, very impressive. Because we are speaking about the English side, we don't talk enough about the French side. So, for instance, the greatest exponent of democracy in America, the very book title, Democracy in America, in terms of freedom, in terms of Enlightenment values, is Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville is, the most fascinating historian, political philosopher, and an activist, and he came from an aristocratic background. So it was not about democracy, it was about freedom. that is liberty, that he was talking about. And he came to America to look into that aspect of it. And there are so many others, Um, Bastiat, for instance,
Frederick
in the
Bastiat, yes,
19th
the law.
century, was again a man, an amazing French thinker, Frederick Bastiat. It would be a different history, I would argue, if Quebec did separate, or if Quebec was an independent state, a French state in North America. That means a Quebec French state in North America, an independent sovereign state in North America, would have inside it, and if it was a democracy, and assuming it is a democracy, then there would be a debate among the French in Quebec between those who are on the left and who are proponents of corporatism in one form or the other, which is what today in Quebec it is. And those who would be opposing that and would be fighting for individual rights and freedom within that independent Quebec state, because they know it would be defending its own position in terms of its own values. However, because Quebec happens to be part of the Federation, the Confederation of Canada, and the psychology and the sociology of the Quebecois elite is one of feeling immense vulnerability, being vulnerable as a minority population in a continent that is predominantly English, and as a minority population by religion and tradition Catholic in a continent that has been predominantly Protestant, that they collectively have fought their battles, whether it is a battle within the Federation, and then eventually in terms of the separatist politics, they have fought the battle as a Quebec people, not in a collective term, not as individual. Maxime stands out because he has embraced the Federation and he wants to walk the path and is walking the path of maintaining the Canadian state and the Canadian Federation together. And in that sense, he is in so many different ways. And I mentioned that in the 2019 election when I had the opportunity to speak, if you may recall. I talked about Maxime as Wilfrid Laurier, the reincarnation of Wilfrid Laurier. Wilfrid Laurier was, I would say, Wilfrid Laurier was the greatest liberal prime minister of Canada. Liberal, not in the party term I'm talking about liberal in terms of ideas and values. He was not Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a man of the left. He was a collectivist. He began on the left, he ended on the left, and he left us with a legacy of leftist politics, which is what we cannot break away from, because he dominated politics during his time so effectively that he made a mincemeat out of the conservative, and all that the conservative could do and has done ever since is just to be me too. We will do it. We'll do it maybe better, but we will do it, And Pierre Elliott Trudeau could destroy his opposition that is on the right, that is a conservative, both in English and in French, and equally effective in both. So that was a unique, the Canadian politics is in that sense very peculiar. This is not a phenomenon that can be repeated in American politics or has happened in American politics. The differences in American politics is a difference where values does count and does come down to, even with the Trump. But I would say, finally, to sum it up on this issue that you have raised, I would say I would go back to, if there is anything that we can take away, in my view, not only from this discussion, but what is conservatism and should be conservatism, for which we can all come together, and we don't have to be a rump. We can be the dominant if we want to, and have the courage to. Then I would go back to Sir Walter Scott. Breathes there a man with soul so dead, who never to himself has said, "This is my own, my native land. This is my own, my native land. I was not born here, but I came. This is it. My children were born here, This is my native land. I was privileged to have come to North America. I'm grateful that the North America I came, that Canada gave me a home, took me in. It is not an entitlement. It was a gift. It was the generosity of Canadians that took me in and gave me the gift to be a Canadian. And my children were born here. So uh, back to Sir Walter Scott, you know, that this is my native land, the love for the land, the love for the people, that is a conservative. And to do everything when one goes into public life, to do everything in devotion to that love, in cherishing that love. And freedom is what makes us who we are, you know, in our breathing. So we don't think about it. We breathe. If we breathe to live, we don't stop and count how many breaths we are taking, you know. It is a natural function. And so to be a conservative is a natural function. Everything else then is artificial. It is a lie. It is a construction. And a conservative stands defending what is natural and reacting against the lies. Whether the lie is branded as a conservative lie or it is branded as a liberal lie. Anything that diminishes freedom and the place of freedom in the life of an individual, the life of a country, the life of the land and its people is then the breath that a conservative takes and opposes any diminution of that. That's what I would say is conservatism. And if we could translate that into political action, if our leaders could have the courage to stand up for that, as Donald Trump did, as Ronald Reagan did, as Margaret Thatcher did, as Abraham Lincoln did, then, you know, we are not a minority party. We are the natural party. We don't have to have a brand called conservative party. In fact, the moment you say conservative party, then you know that you're entering a castle of lies.
I think that your statement that freedom is as natural as breathing is ironic in a day and age when we're forced to wear masks. I think we should leave it there, Salim. That was a great conversation. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.